Alright guys, let's talk about the special binding days. Days. What is days about? Um, I want you to have at the back of your mind that in JavaScript, when we when we reference days, the special binding days, in a way we are referencing an object. There is an object involved somewhere, even though it might not be visible in your code, so to speak. Every time we reference days, we're passing an object reference. Okay? Although how they behave depends on lexical scope, so to speak. Yeah. But then every time you come across days, have it at the back of your mind that there is an object reference being passed somewhere. Okay? It's better demonstrated than explained. So let me open my Visual Studio Code. I'm back here. I'm in my script.js file, and then it's empty at a minute. Okay. Let's have something. Let's play with some code to demonstrate this. If I have function say name, for instance, okay, and then here I'm doing return this the name. Okay, return this the name. Okay, and then here I have another function. Let me call this function introduce. Okay, that's accurate. And then here I say console.log hello everyone. Okay, hello everyone. My name is, and then here I can do say name .call. Then I can pass that object reference here. Now you're looking at this code, you're thinking, where did this come from? What is this? So in this case, this is an implicit reference to an object. So we're implicitly passing an object reference. So which means we have to declare our objects. Okay? So we can have an object here. I can say const object. Now, if you look at the say name function body, in a way, we're really like it's giving it up here because it's saying return this.name. So this is an object, and then this name is a property of that object. Although we were yet to declare that object yet. We're yet to declare the object. So here it's saying return this.name. That is, return an object that has a property. No, return the value of an object, okay, that has property name. So if I set the property here, I say name, and then I do this Ola. Okay? Okay. Now, what do we do? I have to figure a way to invoke either of these functions. Okay? So if I invoke the first function, so the first function is returning this, Abi. Let me see whether the syntax will work. If I say name, now there is a special method that we can use to invoke function. It's called call. Okay, so I can use this to invoke sayName. So here it's saying returning this.name. So this.name, it's an implicit reference to this object. So which means I have to pass this object in here. Okay. If I save this, let me see. I don't think I did any console.log. So let me just play around with this. See, nothing happened. So which means I have to do console.log, because that function is returning and then it's not really doing anything anyway. So it's returning, so I have to log the return value to the console. So if I save this now, let's see what we get. We get hola. You see? So here, function sayName, we're returning this.name. So implicitly, we are passing an object reference. So this refers to an object, and is this name? The name is a property of that object, which we are referencing with the special binding keyword this. Okay, so we have to define that object. So this is the object now. This is the name. This name. Okay. So now look at this second function. Okay, inside this second function introduce, we are calling this function, okay, and then we are passing that object reference using this keyword. Okay, so if to use the second function, I can do introduce.call. Okay, so here this refers to this object. Okay, so I have to pass that here, object. So this is implicit reference, or implicit call, if you like. So if I save this, let's see what we get now. We get hello everyone, my name is Ola. So that's the second function here. Okay, so we're inside this function, and then we are referencing an object implicitly with this keyword. Okay, now there is a way we can do an explicit binding, so to speak. So this is called this implicit binding, if you like, and then we can do this explicitly. And then the way when we do explicitly, then it means we won't have to use the call method. So I can do here. I can do sayName, and then sayName. Okay, so if I do sayName, I want to call this function explicitly now on this object. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do take this away. We don't need this for now. So I'm going to do console.log instead of sayName.call, because I'm calling this explicitly now. Then I can do object.sayName. Then I'll call it like a function like this. Let's see what we get. We get hola. So that is explicit binding. Okay. So I've declared this function here. Okay. I'm just referencing inside this object. I could have written this object inside here. It still would have done the same thing. But I think in here 6, rather than repeating ourselves like this, I think we have the liberty of doing this. Let's see whether this works. Oh, it works. Good. So in here 6, when your what is it called? Your function property and your function value, when they bear the same name, you can do this. Okay, this works. All right. So what if I decide to what is it called? What if I decide to call this function introduce? What do I do? So to do that, let me just use another object here. This const object 1. Then I can do name. So let me say green here. And then here, I can do function. I don't want to use the same name now. I can do introduce. So this is explicit binding. So here, I don't have to do console.log anymore because introduce, this function introduce, I'm using console.log there. Okay, so let's see what we get. If I do object 1 dot function, so this allows me to explicitly bind this. So I'm calling this introduce function. So this function, this is it. So I'm using this key, the keyword fn. So I'm calling it on this object 1. So object 1.fn like this. This should invoke this function. This is, I'm trying out explicit binding here. We've done implicit binding the other time. So let's see what this does. It says, hello everyone, my name is Green. See, it works like that. Okay? So we went from implicitly binding an object to our function, and then we call the function using that special call method. Now we call the function using special call method, and then we pass our object into the function. Now we're doing explicit binding. Okay, don't let this syntax confuse you. Here, rather than doing this, I could have just, so this is just like a convenience now. Like, remember, this is the same thing as this. Okay, but because the key and the value, they share the same name, is why I use ESA syntax to just remove one of them. Okay, so this same name, it's this function. Okay, and this is introduced here, so it's just the key. So when we explicitly bind this, we're just using the function, and then we're using, what is it called, the key to access the value of this function. In any case, this function in the context of an object is a method. Okay, a method is a property of an object that holds that holds a function value. Let me take that again. A method in the context of an object is an object property that holds a function value. Okay? Okay, let me try another approach. I could have const object, and then this is empty. Okay, empty object. Then I can populate it by doing object dot I don't know, gender, and then here I do male. So this is a property of that object. Okay, then I can do object dot fn, so function now. Okay, and then I do what should I do now? Equals to function. Okay, and then inside this function I can say console.log hello everyone, I am your instructor, and my name is, so here I do this, my name is, I am your, this is, okay, my name is this name, so I'm not going to use gender anymore, I'm just going to use name here. So let me use Allah here. Okay. See, this is another approach. So I declare an empty object here, and I'm using a dot notation to populate the object with properties. Okay, the first property is name. It has value Ola. The second property is this fn function, and then the value is this function. See, so in this function I'm doing console.log. Hello everyone, I am your instructor, and my name is this.name. See, so this.name, it's a reference to this object. So this refers to this object. The name refers to the property name. Okay? So what should I do now? Then I can just do objects.fn here. Okay, let's see what we get. Sure enough, we got hello everyone, I'm an instructor and my name is Allah. Okay, so that works. So when you hear this, have it at the back of your mind that this is a reference to some kind of object. Okay, this is a reference to some kind of object. Okay, let me try another approach here. I could have done const object, okay, and then here I could have done name, Allah, okay, and then here I could have done function, okay, and then here I could have done console.log. My name is this the name. Okay, so this is the current object, name is this property. Okay, so outside of here, then I could do object dot function. Let's see what we get. We get my name is Allah. Okay, I hope you're getting it. So when we use this, we're making a reference to an object. Okay, now we've talked about implicit reference, we've talked about explicit reference. I don't want to complicate this, but let's go back to, let's have a function, let's function greet for instance. Okay, and then here we say console.log this dot value. All right, console.log this dot value. Remember we said whenever you see this, it's a reference to some kind of object. So this is an object, value is a property of the object this. Okay, so which means we have to define our objects. Okay, now if I did this, if I did var value, I'm sorry, I'm using var again. I told you not to use var, but I'm using it for demonstration purpose. I just want to show you something here. So I did var value equals to hello. Okay, now let me invoke this function. Great. Let's see what we get. We get hello. Now, how is this possible? It sounds like I'm contradicting myself because we said this is a reference to an object. But you look at our code, although function in a sense is an object, but this it's not a reference to this function. No, this is a reference to an object. But you look at here, we don't have any object explicitly declared in our code. So what does this point to in this sense? Remember when we discussed JavaScript variables, we said var, variables declared with var can be called on the window object. That is, they can be attached to the window object. And then we said the window object is the global object in the browser. Okay? So in that sense, look at this variable value. It was declared with var keyword. Because it was declared with var keyword, we can access it on the global object in our browser environment. Okay? So remember, we are doing this in the browser. So this refers to the window object. Okay? So this is actually window.value. Okay? So I've shown you this works a bit here. Good, it works. All right. Now, if I go here and then I say window.value, check this out. It still works. Hello. That's to tell you that the days that we used before now is referencing the window object, which is consistent with our position on days. That when we said days, it's a reference to some kind of object. So when we use days the other time, when we did days, the value, days was referencing our window object, which is the global object in the browser. Okay? I hope you get that. Okay. Now, another thing is, if we look at this function body, for instance, if we use strict mode, use strict, let's see what we get. Aha. Uncalled type error cannot do properties of undefined reading value at grades. Hold on. Reading value at grades. Okay. So when we use strict mode, we are not allowed to bind this to the window object. That's why we're getting that error. Okay? But if we use strict, we're getting it again. Hello. Okay? Of course, if you change this to const or var, we're gonna get error. Okay, undefined now. Okay, undefined. So we get undefined here because for const and let, we cannot bind to the window object. That's why we're getting undefined. Okay? We cannot. Let me take this up. And let's see whether, because var is oystered. Let me take this up. And let me see whether the behavior is consistent. We still get undefined. Okay? So in any case, I didn't even have to take it up because functions declared with the function keyword, they are oystered to the top of the scope anyway. So I can just take this back. It doesn't have any effect, so to speak. The same way, if I change this to let, let's say, it's still undefined. Okay? So we are not allowed to bind to this, the global object, the window object, with let or const keyword. But when we go back to var allows us to bind to the window objects. Okay? All right. What else could be tried? Now, the other time when we use strict, we got the error, right? Say we decide to, and the reason why is because where the function body was inside use strict. This is what I'm talking about when we do use strict. See, the function body is inside use strict. So like we're getting undefined. Okay. What if we decide to do this? What if we decide to, instead of doing this, instead of calling this function here, say we use is a, what is it called? Immediately invoke function expression. So we did something like this, okay? And then here we have function, okay? And then here we do use strict, and then here we say greet, okay? We use strict here, and then we call in greet here. Let's see what we get. We get hello. Now this is interesting because we are doing use strict here, and we're still able to bind to the window object. So what is happening here is, even though we're using use strict inside is immediately invoke function expression, because the body of the function we're invoking is not inside here. It's only the invocation that is inside here. We're still able to bind to the window object. But if we use this use strict here, flag here, we use this use strict expression, and then we put it here, we won't be able to bind to the window object. And the reason is because the function body is inside the use strict. So it's not there now. If you look at this function body, there's no use strict there. But use strict is here. But the function body is not here. We're just invoking it. So it still allows us to bypass the constraint, and it allows us to bind to the window object. Okay? That's another one. We could have lexical disk. Lexical disk. Okay. How do we go about lexical disk? Let me cite an example. If you have a function, okay? So you have a function, for instance. I don't know, what should I call this function? If I call this function divide coordinates, okay? And then inside here, I say console.log, watch this dot coordinates, this is the coords dot map, okay? So I'm using map, so which means there is an array somewhere, right? And then let me say I use C, okay? And then I do C divided by this dot length. Okay. Now what is going on here? There's a function divide chord, and then this function is logging these dot chords. Okay, this method, okay, right? Now there is these dot chords here. There is these dot length here. There is an arrow function here. Good. Functions declared with the function keyword, they declare their own days. Okay? Arrow function, they do not declare their own days. What they do is they inherit from the lexical scope of the outside function. Let me finish this. So here I can do, should I do explicit call now? Or implicit call? Okay, I can do implicit call. I can do divide quad, okay, dot call, okay. And then I'm going to pass the first object here. The first object is quads. What am I doing? The first object is quads. Okay, so let me say 0, 2, 4, 6, 8. The second property is length. So the length is 5. The length is 5. So let's see what we get. And then I'm going to come back and explain what is going on here. Okay, see what we get. We get 0, 0 0.4, 0 0.8, 1.2, 1.6. This is what we get, Abi. So it's working. Now, I have to explain what is happening here. There is a function, divide chord, and with this function, we are looping through an array. This array, the array is quads, okay? And then, of course, when we loop through an array, there's a callback function somewhere, okay? Then we say, okay, for every item in these quads, this C represents every item in this quad. Return each of these items divided by these dot length. Okay. Now, these dot quads, this is a reference to this object inside this divide dot call. Okay, so this is objects. Okay, so quads is a property of this object. Okay, can I make it more obvious like this? Okay, okay, so I can do this. I think we're familiar with this approach. Okay, so this property quads is what we're referencing here with the days binding. So days refers to this object. This is implicit call, by the way, guys. This is implicit call. We've touched on it the other time. Okay. Now, when we get into this arrow function, we said arrow function do not declare their own days. So these days is a reference. No, these days it's inheriting from the outside days in this divide chord, if that makes sense. Otherwise, when we got here, because this is not function entirely, when we got here, I didn't mean arrow functions declare their own days. Maybe we could have done these of length. Okay, but we didn't do that. So because we didn't do that because arrow functions, they do not declare their own days. So this days that we are saying here, it's inheriting from the outside function scope here. So this days refers to this length 5. Okay, and then it works. Okay, let me do another one to drive this in. If we have function food, for instance, okay, and then inside this function we're returning, so returning what is it called? So returning an arrow function. Okay, so returning an arrow function, we say console.log console.log these dot none. Of course, we have to pass none here, otherwise. Console.log this dot none. Now, this is an arrow. This function is returning an arrow function. Okay. The days that we have in the body of this arrow function is inheriting from the days scope of the function foo. Okay, if that makes sense. So days is inheriting from the scope of function foo. The arrow function is not declaring its own days. It's inheriting from the lexical scope of function foo. Okay, so because of that, we can do, remember, we still have to define our object. So we can do const object, and then we can do here, we can do num, maybe we call that 6. Okay, now this is where it gets interesting. Remember, this foo function is returning an arrow function. Okay, if I try to say I do console.log this is going to be implicit call now. Console.log foo.call. Okay? And then I'm going to pass the object inside this. So which is object. Let's see what we get. Just go back to the console. See? It's not, we're not getting any value. We just, our expression is being, or is our statement is being logged back to the console. And that's because this full function, you see, here we are calling the full function. All right? That's what we're doing here. But this full function is returning another function. Okay? And then we are accessing the property object with this binding. And we said this is inheriting from the lexical scope of this function foo. Okay? So in order for us to get this value, num6, we can do something like this. We can do const result equals to foo.call. Okay? And then we have to call that arrow function here. So the way we do that, we can do console.log result.call. Then we can pass the object in here. Let's see what we get. Now we get 6. I've explained why we're getting undefined the other time in the course of our series. So you can watch the other series. I've explained why we're getting undefined. So we get 6 here. So in a sense, the arrow function is retaining the this binding of this function foo. Okay? Because it doesn't declare its own this. It's inheriting from the lexical scope of this function foo. All right? Well, I hope that makes sense. Let me try another approach. Let's try another one. What should I do? Let's have function greet. Okay, function greet. I can think of something to use other than greet. It's like, okay, so what if here we have set timeout? Of course, set timeout will take an arrow function, right? Okay, and then I can say console.log hello, I am, then here this dot name. Okay. There's one more argument I have not. There's one more argument I have not passed inside this set timeout. Let's say 100. So that's the time it take. Okay. So here, what should I do? Of course, I'm using this, so I have to define the object. So I say const object, and then here I'm doing name. Hola. Okay. So I can call this function by doing greet.call using the special call method. Okay. And then I'm going to pass the object in it. So what do we have here? Let's see. Does it work? Hello, I am Hola. It works. Okay? Now, we have a set timeout here. Remember, we said, so there's an arrow function here. Remember, we said arrow functions do not declare their own this. They inherit from the lexical scope of the outside function. Okay, so this.name, this refers to the lexical scope of this function greets. Okay, it's another function embedded inside this function. Okay, so because arrow functions do not declare their own this binding, is why we're able to use this.name here and still get this value. Otherwise, we will be doing this.name, if that makes sense. Okay, now imagine I didn't use arrow function here. Say I didn't use arrow function here. Okay, say instead of arrow function, I use function keyword. Okay, let's see what we get. Let's see what we get. Instead of arrow function, let's say I use function keyword. Let's see. If I do here, I do function. Okay, then I do this. And then I'm going to bring this here. Come on. And then I'm going to put this inside here. Okay, I'm using a function. Okay, and I'm using this.name inside this function, this set timeout. But instead of using the arrow function, arrow callback, I'm using our traditional function approach. Now let me save this. Let's see what we get. Hello, I am okay. See, I'm getting hello, I am, but the value of this.name, I can access it. And the reason I can access it is because I'm using a function keyword here. Okay? So this cannot reference this object in this scope. Okay? This could not reference this object in this scope because I've rewritten this from arrow function to our regular function using a function keyword. Okay? So if I wish to make this work, I have to explicitly bind this outside of this set timeout. Because now we're not using arrow function, which would have given us the leverage of accessing the lexical scope of greet inside this set timeout method. So using this function keyword here, the way I can make this work is to explicitly bind this to the scope of this greet. So the way we do that is to do var self, var is global, this. Okay? So I'm binding this using this self. So which means rather than using this here, instead of using this here, I'm going to use self. Okay? Now self is referencing this object. Okay? So if I save this, let's see what we get. Aha, now we get it. Hello, I am Ola. You see? But if I had used arrow function here, I wouldn't have to go through this approach of explicitly binding this to the scope of this greet. Okay? I hope that makes sense. So, to wrap things up, I don't want to drag this too long. We're still going to talk about prototype, object-oriented programming, classes, and the like. So I'm going to stop here for now. So as a closer, when we use this, the special binding this is referencing some kind of objects. Okay? This is referencing some kind of object. And then we can reference that implicitly, explicitly, or through this lexical this, as the case may be. Okay? So I hope you've learned something. If you have questions, please don't be shy. Leave a comment below. I'll make time to address your questions. Okay? And then please like and subscribe. I'll see you guys in the next tutorial. Thank you.